The 1980s gave us turbo dreams, digital dashboards, and futuristic styling. But not every car from that decade aged well. In fact, many turned out to be some of the worst mistakes in automotive history. Underpowered engines, cheap plastic interiors, rust-prone bodies, and electronics that failed before the warranty was up made plenty of 80s cars a nightmare to own. And now, in 2025, some of these same failures are being hyped up as collectible classics, when the truth is they're still worthless money pits. Here are the 12 worthless 80s cars now in 2025. Don't buy them. The unreliable, the ugly, and the disappointments that should stay forgotten. Stick around till the end, and don't forget to subscribe.
The 1982 Cadillac Cimarron has gone down in history as one of the most infamous missteps ever committed by an American luxury brand, a car so reviled that it nearly became shorthand for automotive cynicism. When it was introduced, Cadillac's marketing department promised buyers a compact luxury sedan that would allow the brand to compete with the growing wave of imported European sports sedans like the BMW 3 Series and Audi 4000. Instead, what customers got was quite literally a Chevrolet Cavalier in disguise, slathered in some chrome, fitted with leather seats, and carrying the Cadillac crest. To anyone who drove one, it was obvious that the Cimarron was little more than a badge engineering experiment rushed to market with minimal thought and a maximum dose of misplaced corporate optimism. The trouble began under the hood. The Cimarron launched with GM's 1.8-liter inline-4, making a pitiful 88 horsepower, paired to either a 4-speed manual or a lethargic 3-speed automatic. This was not just underwhelming, it was insulting. Here was a Cadillac, a brand synonymous with effortless V8 power and prestige, and it struggled to keep pace with commuter econoboxes from Japan. 0 to 60 often took over 14 seconds, which meant that merging onto the highway was a gamble. Owners often complained of flooring the accelerator, only to be greeted with a moan of protest from the engine and very little forward thrust. "I paid Cadillac money for this," one disillusioned owner remarked, "and my neighbor's Accord left me in the dust every single time." Inside, Cadillac tried desperately to dress up the Cavalier's bones with leather upholstery, wood veneer trim, and extra sound insulation. The result was an odd mix of cheap GM plastic paired with luxury add-ons that looked tacked on at the last minute. The ergonomics remained very much Cavalier-like, meaning cheap switchgear and uninspired design. Buyers who had owned traditional Cadillacs like the Fleetwood or Eldorado were aghast. One owner recalled, "I remember sitting in it and thinking, this is a Cavalier with lipstick. The only thing Cadillac about it was the badge on the steering wheel." What truly destroyed the Cimarron's reputation, however, was not just its lack of performance or its uninspired design, but the price Cadillac dared to charge for it. With a sticker price starting around $12,000 in 1982, roughly double the cost of a Cavalier, the Cimarron competed directly with cars that actually delivered on the promise of luxury and performance, such as the BMW 320i or Mercedes 190e. Buyers who took the plunge quickly realized they had been sold a cynical rebadge at Cadillac's most ambitious price point. Breakdown-prone, underpowered, and embarrassingly unrefined, the Cimarron turned what should have been Cadillac's entry into the compact luxury market into a corporate punchline. Over the years, the Cimarron has been widely mocked by journalists, enthusiasts, and former owners alike. It is frequently cited as the car that nearly destroyed Cadillac's reputation in the 1980s, a symbol of General Motors' arrogance and lack of understanding of its customers. Owners told horror stories of electrical failures, failing transmissions, and paint that peeled within a few years. "Mine spent more time at the dealer than in my driveway," another frustrated owner admitted. "And every time I got the bill, I reminded myself I could have had a BMW instead." In today's collector car world, the Cimarron sits in a strange place. On one hand, its reputation is so bad that it has developed a sort of ironic cult following, where enthusiasts joke about its existence and keep a few examples running purely as conversation pieces. On the other, the idea that someone in 2025 might ask $20,000 for one is laughable. For that money, you could buy a pristine Fleetwood Brougham, a Survivor Eldorado, or even a lightly used European sedan that runs circles around the Cimarron. For many enthusiasts, the Cimarron represents a cautionary tale that prestige cannot simply be glued onto an economy car, that luxury requires substance, not just a badge. In the end, the 1982 Cadillac Cimarron remains a historical footnote, a reminder of the dangers of rushing a car to market without giving it the engineering or quality it deserves. It is remembered less as a Cadillac and more as a betrayal of what Cadillac was supposed to represent. While some cars gain admiration with age, the Cimarron gains only infamy, its name still spoken with a smirk by collectors and a groan by those who once owned one. Do you want me to expand further into how the Cimarron's failure directly affected Cadillac's brand image in the 80s and 90s, and why enthusiasts still use it as a benchmark for worst American cars ever built?
The 1984 Ford Mustang SVO is one of those fascinating automotive experiments that seemed brilliant on paper, ambitious in execution, but painfully mismatched with the desires of its audience. Ford's Special Vehicle Operations (SVO) division envisioned the SVO as a high-tech alternative to the brute force 5.0 V8 GT that was rapidly becoming the face of the Fox body Mustang revival. Instead of relying on big displacement and raw torque, the SVO would showcase advanced engineering, a 2.3-liter turbocharged inline-4 with fuel injection, producing 175 horsepower, later bumped to 205 in 1985.5, bolted to a 5-speed manual, 4-wheel disc brakes, and a sophisticated suspension tuned for handling rather than straight-line sprints. It was Ford's attempt to prove that American muscle could be reborn as something more European, a rival to cars like the Porsche 944 or BMW 3 Series, rather than just another boulevard bruiser. But there was a fatal flaw. Mustang buyers didn't want a European-style Mustang. They wanted V8 rumble, cheap speed, and tire smoke. The SVO, by comparison, was a delicate machine with quirks that made it frustrating to live with. Turbo lag was immense by modern standards. Mash the throttle at low RPM, and the car felt gutless, only for the boost to slam in suddenly, unsettling the chassis. The 2.3 turbo had potential, but in factory trim it lacked the effortless low-end torque of the 5.0 V8, and buyers quickly realized the GT felt faster in everyday driving, even if the SVO was more sophisticated on a track. Worse still, the SVO weighed more than the 5.0 GT, thanks to its added tech and heavier suspension components, further dulling its appeal. Then there was the price. In 1984, a Mustang GT 5.0 could be had for around $9,500. The SVO, nearly $15,000. That placed it dangerously close to European imports like the 944 and significantly above its own V8 stablemate. To the average Mustang shopper, the math simply didn't add up. Why spend luxury money for a 4-cylinder Mustang with weird offset hood scoops, strange biplane spoilers, and headlights that look slightly alien when the 5.0 GT was cheaper, faster, and more visceral? One disgruntled owner later quipped, "You paid Porsche money for a Pinto engine with a turbo." Despite its commercial failure, the SVO has since earned a complicated legacy. Collectors today often praise it as ahead of its time, pointing out its turbocharged 4-cylinder performance would eventually become the industry standard. They note its 4-wheel disc brakes, Connie shocks, limited slip rear, and rack and pine steering as signs of Ford's attempt to drag the Mustang into the modern performance world. In hindsight, the SVO foreshadowed the EcoBoost Mustangs of the 2010s. But that doesn't change the fact that in 1984, the Mustang buying public wanted nothing to do with it. The 5.0 GT outsold it by huge margins, and the SVO quickly became the Mustang that sat on dealer lots, waiting for a buyer that rarely came. Owners from the period have mixed recollections. Some loved the uniqueness, claiming that handled better than any Mustang they had ever driven and that the turbo rush was intoxicating when it finally kicked in. Others hated the quirks, the lack of refinement, and the constant repairs. Turbo seals, electronics, and boost controllers were all prone to failure, leaving many SVOs sidelined long before their V8 brothers. One ex-owner lamented, "It was like dating someone exotic and high maintenance. You were impressed at first, but eventually you just wanted someone simpler and more reliable." Today, the 1984 Mustang SVO remains a niche collectible. It has a cult following among fox body enthusiasts who admire its rarity and its vision, but most Mustang fans still gravitate towards the burly simplicity of the 5.0. At auctions, SVOs don't fetch anywhere near the money of a clean GT or Cobra of the same era, though pristine survivors are slowly creeping upward in value due to their scarcity. Still, its reputation lingers as the Mustang that nobody wanted at the time. A reminder that being ahead of your time isn't always enough when your audience just wants burnouts and V8 thunder.
The 1980 Chevrolet Citation X11 is one of those cars that perfectly sums up the awkward, confused, and sometimes disastrous state of Detroit in the early 1980s. On paper, it looked like a genuine attempt by Chevrolet to move into modern territory and compete with the flood of small, efficient imports that were eating up market share. The Citation was GM's first mass-produced front-wheel drive car, the supposed future of the company. It was compact, lightweight, economical, and, according to GM's advertising, years ahead of its time. And for buyers who didn't want to look like they were just settling for a family economy box, Chevrolet offered the sporty X11 package. This was meant to be the cool version, the performance variant, the one young buyers could take seriously. It had a hotter 2.8-liter V6, a suspension tuned for handling, wide tires, blackout trim, stripes and decals that screamed, "This is not just your mom's grocery getter." Chevy even bragged in advertisements that it had been tested and tuned on the same proving grounds as the Corvette. The problem was that while the idea was bold, the execution was a catastrophe. GM rushed the Citation to market to beat competitors, and what rolled off the assembly line was closer to a prototype than a finished product. Within months of its release, customers were flooding dealerships with complaints. The car had brutal quality control issues, transmissions that failed in the first year, brakes that warped or seized, suspension parts that wore out prematurely, and electrical systems that behaved like they were haunted. The X11, despite being marketed as a performance machine, inherited every one of these problems and added a few of its own. It was infamous for torque steer so violent that if you floored the gas pedal, the steering wheel practically tried to yank itself out of your hands. Road testers in 1980 described it as an experience best handled with both arms locked straight. And yet, when everything was working, which wasn't often, the X11 could surprise you. The 2.8-liter high-output V6 made it one of the quicker domestic hatchbacks of its day, capable of running the quarter mile in the high 16s, which in 1980 wasn't terrible. Some owners who managed to get well-assembled examples reported that the handling was sharp compared to other American compacts, and the car could genuinely carve through corners with a liveliness you didn't expect from GM. But those were the exceptions. For most, the dream quickly turned into a nightmare. Owners remember constant trips back to the dealership. One recalled, "I loved how it looked, and when it ran right, it was fun, but by the time I hit 30,000 miles, I had replaced the clutch twice, the brakes 3 times, and the dealer knew me by name." Styling was another issue. While Chevy tried to jazz up the Citation with the X11 package, stripes, spoilers, badges, rally wheels, it was still a boxy little hatchback that looked more like a rental car than a sports car. Buyers drawn in by the ads, expecting something that could stand toe-to-toe with a Mustang or Camaro, found themselves behind the wheel of what looked like an economy commuter with stickers. Young drivers in the early 80s sometimes tried to street race these cars, but the results were often laughable. One anecdote from a period owner tells the story of lining up against a buddy's Fox body Mustang at a stoplight. He dumped the clutch, the wheels spun wildly, the steering wheel yanked hard to the left, and by the time he got the car straightened out, the Mustang was already gone. He summed it up years later with the line, "It was like wrestling a bear just to drive in a straight line." The recalls didn't help either. The Citation became notorious in its day as one of GM's most recalled cars. In some years, nearly every unit sold came back for mandatory repairs. The X11's performance reputation couldn't survive that kind of stigma. By 1985, the entire Citation line was discontinued, its reputation in ruins, and the X11 was remembered as a sporty pretender that never lived up to its own hype. Today, the Citation X11 is almost a ghost. Unlike the Mustang SVO or Dodge Shelby Charger, both of which developed quirky cult followings, the X11 is virtually forgotten. Survivors are incredibly rare, not because they are valuable collectibles, but because so few people bothered to save them. Most rotted away in driveways, broke down beyond repair, or were sent to the junkyard as soon as something expensive failed. When one does pop up for sale, it's usually in rough shape, and the asking price is laughable compared to what it is. Collectors of oddball 80s iron may have some curiosity, but no serious muscle car enthusiast is spending real money on an X11. That's the irony of the car. It was meant to be GM's bold step into the future, a modern front-wheel drive performance hatchback to compete with the Europeans and Japanese. Instead, it became a symbol of everything wrong with Detroit at the time. Rushed engineering, poor quality, flashy marketing that couldn't cover up deep flaws, and a performance promise that never matched reality. Owners who lived through it remember the frustration more than the fun. As one bitterly put it, it looked like a sports car, it was priced like a sports car, but in the end it drove like a broken shopping cart with racing stripes. The 1985 Dodge Charger 2.2 is one of those cars that makes die-hard Mopar fans wince even to this day, because it carried one of Chrysler's most sacred muscle car names into one of the company's strangest and least flattering eras. When you hear Dodge Charger, you think of wide-hipped late 60s B-bodies with massive Hemis and RT stripes burning up drag strips, or maybe even the early 70s NASCAR dominating versions with their Coke bottle styling. What you don't expect is a stubby front-wheel drive, K-car-based hatchback with just over 100 horsepower trying desperately to look sporty. Yet that's exactly what Chrysler sold in the mid-1980s, and the result was a car that quickly became the punchline of Mopar jokes. To understand the 1985 Charger 2.2, you have to remember Chrysler's situation. By the late 1970s, the company was on the ropes financially. The fuel crises and emissions laws had killed the big block muscle cars, and Chrysler's survival depended on Lee Iacocca's K-car platform, cheap front-wheel drive compacts that saved the company from bankruptcy. Chrysler that dusted off the Charger name and slapped it onto a stretched, sportier version of Dodge's Omni Horizon hatchback. In truth, it was more a badge-engineered Plymouth Turismo than anything resembling the Charger heritage. Chrysler's thinking was simple. Give the economy car a famous muscle car badge and some decals, and maybe younger buyers would flock to it. The standard Charger 2.2 in 1985 came with Chrysler's 2.2-liter four-cylinder, making around 96 horsepower. Even when tuned for high output, it was barely pushing 110 horses, which in a 2,400-pound hatchback meant acceleration that was acceptable for commuting, but a joke compared to the name it carried. 0 to 60 took about 10 to 11 seconds, and the quarter-mile dragged by in the mid-17s. That might not sound tragic in the context of the early 80s, when most cars were slow, but calling this thing a Charger was borderline insulting to anyone who remembered the tire-shredding legends of the late 60s. Mopar purists still shake their heads. The nameplate once associated with big Hollies and 4-speed Hurst shifters was now attached to a boxy compact with economy car bones. Styling didn't help. Dodge tried to dress up the Charger 2.2 with spoilers, stripes, and sporty wheels, but at the end of the day, it was still a squared-off Econ box with a hatch. Compared to the sleek, aggressive muscle cars that had built the Charger's reputation, this car looked like something you'd expect to see in a college parking lot, not at a drag strip. The rear hatch and upright proportions made it look more practical than powerful, which might have been fine if it had been called anything else. Calling it a Charger felt almost like a parody. Driving one wasn't particularly memorable either. The steering was light but numb, the suspension was tuned for safety more than excitement, and torque steer could make hard acceleration feel like a battle with the front wheels. The four-cylinder engine buzzed loudly when pushed, and while it was reliable enough for daily driving, it was never thrilling. Road testers at the time gave it faint praise for being thrifty and easy to live with, but when Dodge dared to market it as a sporty alternative to a Mustang or Camaro, the critics were merciless. The one saving grace, at least in hindsight, was that Dodge did work with Carroll Shelby to create hotter versions of this platform. The Shelby Charger, introduced in 1983 and improved throughout the decade, had upgraded suspension, better gearing, and eventually a turbocharged version of the 2.2-liter that made well over 170 horsepower. Those cars could legitimately surprise people and carved out their own cult following. But the plain Charger 2.2 from 1985, that was the rental car version. It had none of Shelby's magic, just the watered-down reality of a famous name on an economy hatch. As enthusiasts often say, slapping Shelby badge on the later models helped, but it couldn't erase the embarrassment of what Dodge was selling as the Charger to begin with. Owners who had them rarely speak with much fondness. One quipped in an online forum, "I bought it because I thought I was getting a Charger. What I got was a Horizon with stripes." Another summed it up even better. The only thing it charged was the battery when it broke down. These weren't cars you bragged about. They were cheap, they were disposable, and most of them didn't survive long enough to make it to the collector's stage. Today, the 1985 Charger 2.2 is almost forgotten, overshadowed by both its glorious muscle car ancestors and the far more interesting Shelby-tuned turbo versions that followed. If one pops up at a car show, it's usually good for a chuckle, not admiration. Asking serious money for a plain 2.2 model today is laughable. This is one of those cars that Mopar people would rather pretend never happened. It remains a rolling reminder of just how far Chrysler had fallen from the heights of the muscle car era, and how badly the company was willing to stretch a legendary name just to sell an economy car in the age of austerity. The 1982 Pontiac J2000 is one of those cars that perfectly illustrates just how far Pontiac had strayed from its "We Build Excitement" slogan by the early 1980s. On paper, the idea seems straightforward enough. GM had rolled out the new J-body platform, compact front-wheel drive, affordable, and every division was given its own flavor. Chevy got the Cavalier, Olds had the Forenza, Buick the Skyhawk, and Pontiac was supposed to inject some sport into the family with the J2000. Unfortunately, what they delivered was a small, buzzy, underpowered box with a Pontiac split grille glued to the front. It looked like a committee car, felt like a Cavalier in drag, and drove like something you borrowed from a rental agency in 1984 because the only other option was walking. The base engine was GM's notorious Iron Duke 2.0-liter four-cylinder, making a laughable 88 horsepower. Calling it Duke was about the only tough thing about it, because in reality, it wheezed, vibrated, and strained its way through every gear like it was dragging an anchor. Later models got an 18-centimeter Brazilian built 4, but it was just as gutless. 0 to 60 times stretched into the 13-15-second range, which was slow even by the lethargic standards of the early 80s. Pair that with sloppy manual shifters or an ancient 3-speed automatic, and you had a car that never lived up to Pontiac's reputation for performance. One journalist at the time wrote, "The J2000 is not so much fun to drive as it is determined to remind you how little fun exists in the world right now." Build quality was, in typical early 80s GM fashion, embarrassing. Plastic interiors cracked within a few summers, dashboards warped, trim pieces fell off, and the electrical system was legendary for doing whatever it pleased. Owners often joked that the headlights had moods. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. Fuse boxes corroded. Window regulators failed with monotonous regularity. Even the seat tracks were known to bind, leaving drivers stuck in awkward positions. The J2000 quickly earned a reputation for being one of the least reliable Pontiacs ever sold, And given the division's history of solid full-size sedans and muscle cars, that's saying a lot. Pontiac tried desperately to add excitement by offering different trims, hatchbacks, notchbacks, and later a so-called sporty version called the J2000 Sunbird with a slightly stronger four-cylinder. But no matter how many stripes or badges they stuck on, underneath it all was the same fragile J-body with no real redeeming features. The marketing campaign leaned hard on the idea of European-inspired driving dynamics. But if you compared it to a Volkswagen Rabbit or a Honda Accord of the same era, the J2000 felt like a bad joke. Handling was mushy, steering vague, and braking distances long enough to make drivers sweat. Owners from the period are blunt about how miserable they were. One recalled, "Bought it new in '83, and within 6 months, the alternator, the fuel pump, and the radio all died. At 40,000 miles, the transmission went. My dad's old Catalina had 200,000 on it before it ever needed a wrench." Another described it even harsher. The J2000 was the kind of car you prayed would get stolen because insurance would give you more than it was worth. Even mechanics hated them, calling them the car that made people stop trusting Pontiac. By the mid-'80s, GM quietly dropped the J2000 name and just called it the Sunbird, hoping to shake the stigma. But the damage was done. Enthusiasts still remember it as one of the worst attempts at excitement Pontiac ever made. A car that wore the Arrowhead badge but had none of the fire or attitude the brand had built in the muscle car era. Today, if you stumble across one, it's usually sitting forgotten in a junkyard or rotting in a field. Collectors have no interest, and even nostalgia hasn't given it any redemption. In 2025, the J2000 remains a cautionary tale. You'll occasionally see some optimist listing one for $6,000 on Craigslist, pitching it as a rare survivor. But in reality, it's still what it always was, a cavalier in a Pontiac mask, slow, fragile, and unloved. Unlike a GTO, a Firebird, or even a Grand Prix, it's not part of Pontiac history people want to celebrate. It's the kind of car enthusiasts pretend never existed, and for good reason. It dragged down a brand that once defined American performance, reducing it to a punchline about corporate badge engineering gone horribly wrong. Do you want me to make the next write-ups even darker? Like a full owner trauma file filled with horror stories from people who felt swindled by cars like this?
The 1981 AMC Spirit DL is one of those forgotten cars that feels more like a symbol of survival than of innovation. By the early 1980s, AMC was running on fumes, financially, technologically, and creatively. They had Jeep, which was keeping the lights on, but their passenger car lineup was a patchwork of old platforms, new names, and desperate facelifts. The Spirit DL was supposed to be the modern small car in their stable, but the truth was, it was just a mildly updated AMC Gremlin dressed in slightly sleeker sheet metal. Unfortunately, no amount of reshaped rooflines and vinyl trim could hide the fact that this was a design rooted in the 1970s, being sold in a market that was rapidly shifting toward fuel efficiency, refinement, and import competition. Under the hood, the Spirit DL was as uninspiring as its badge suggested. The base power plant was a lethargic 2.5-liter inline-4 AMC developed in-house, an engine that barely made 82 horsepower. Buyers could opt for the ancient 232 or 258 cubic inch straight six, but those engines were better suited for Jeeps than for a small coupe trying to fight Honda Civics and Toyota Corollas. In 1981, when competitors were offering smoother, fuel-injected engines and crisp manual transmissions, AMC's offerings felt like leftovers from a different era. Car magazines of the time were brutally honest. One review quipped, "The Spirit DL doesn't so much accelerate as it eventually decides to reach speed, assuming you're patient and forgiving." The interior was equally underwhelming. AMC tried to dress it up with fake wood trim, plush fabrics, and some chrome accents, but the fit and finish were bargain basement. Plastic panels rattled, door seals leaked, and the wiring harness was infamous for developing phantom electrical issues. The dash layout was decades behind its competition, with toggle switches and gauges that looked like they'd been carried over from the 1970s Hornet. Owners often recalled how quickly the materials aged. Fabrics wore thin in a year, vinyl cracked in 2, and the carpet seemed to shed fibers like an old rug. It was a car that felt cheap the moment you sat in it, even though AMC was trying to sell it as a competitor in the compact personal coupe market. What makes the Spirit DL especially tragic is that it was released into a world that had no patience left for half-hearted cars. In 1981, buyers were turning to imports in droves because cars like the Honda Accord, Toyota Corolla, and Datsun 210 were simply better in every measurable way. They were quieter, more reliable, more efficient, and often cheaper to run. AMC, meanwhile, was building a car that felt like a warmed-over 1970s reject, and buyers noticed. Sales were poor, and even AMC loyalists admitted the Spirit DL felt like the end of the line. Owner stories from the era are full of frustration. One recalled, "I bought a Spirit DL new because I wanted to support AMC, but within a year the door hinges sagged, the carburetor kept stalling in traffic, and the dealer told me to just live with it." Another said, "I traded my Gremlin for a Spirit thinking it would be better. It wasn't. It was the same car with different stripes, and it still broke down every month." These weren't isolated cases. Reliability issues, weak performance, and cheap construction were universal complaints. AMC did try to inject some excitement into the Spirit lineup with the AMX and later the limited-run Spirit AMX Concord packages, but those were niche models. The DL, the volume seller, was as beige and lifeless as a car could be, and it wore down AMC's credibility further at a time when the company could least afford it. Today, the Spirit DL is barely remembered. AMC fans might keep a few alive out of nostalgia, but collectors avoid them almost entirely. Unlike AMC's more interesting misfits like the Eagle 4x4 or the Rebel Machine, the Spirit DL has no cult following, no quirky charm. It was simply one of AMC's last gasps, an outdated, underpowered, and uninspired compact in an era that demanded more. In 2025, if you see one, it's either rusting behind a barn or clinging to life in the hands of an eccentric AMC diehard. It's fitting that people call it one of AMC's sad final acts, because that's exactly what it was. The Spirit DL wasn't a bad idea. It was just a hopelessly outdated execution, released by a company that had already run out of time. Do you want me to make the next write-ups of these worthless 80s cars even longer, weaving in the collapse of their brands and how they dragged entire divisions down with them?
The 1986 Chrysler Laser XT is one of those strange cars that reminds you just how confused Chrysler was in the mid-1980s. At the time, Chrysler was still clawing its way out of bankruptcy, saved by the success of the K-Car and Lee Iacocca's relentless marketing. The company desperately wanted to project an image of technology and performance, something that could appeal to younger buyers who were flocking to European and Japanese turbo coupes, like the Volkswagen Scirocco, Toyota Celica, and Nissan 200SX. The Laser was their answer. A sleek, wedge-shaped front-wheel drive coupe built on Chrysler's G-body platform and loaded with electronic gizmos. On paper, the 1986 Chrysler Laser XT looked like a high-tech bargain. In reality, it was a fragile, overhyped machine that couldn't back up its futuristic promise. Chrysler marketed the Laser XT as the premium, upscale twin to the Dodge Daytona. The two cars were nearly identical under the skin, but the Laser was supposed to be the sophisticated one. Chrysler's brochures were full of talk about European-inspired handling, futuristic electronics, and turbocharged excitement. The XT trim was the top of the line, featuring a 2.2-liter turbocharged four-cylinder producing 146 horsepower. On paper, that sounded competitive, but the problem was the delivery. The turbo suffered from massive lag, with drivers waiting an eternity for boost to build, only to be rewarded with a short, uneven surge of power before the revs ran out.
Compared to the silky, linear power of Japanese competitors, or even the stronger V6 engines from GM, the Laser XT felt both coarse and underwhelming. The real selling point Chrysler pushed was technology. The Laser XT was stuffed with digital readouts, talking dashboard warnings, and even an optional electronic voice alert system that would calmly tell you things like, "Door is ajar," or "Your headlights are on." To buyers in 1986, this sounded like something out of a sci-fi movie, but the reality was far less glamorous. The electronics were glitchy, prone to failure, and expensive to fix. Owners often joked that their Laser XT talked more about what was wrong with it than what was working. When the dashboards worked, they looked impressive, but most ended up with dead pixels, flickering lights, or completely non-functional displays by the early 1990s. One former owner recalled, "The car spent more time at the dealer for electrical gremlins than it did on the road. Every time the dash went dark, they told me it would cost hundreds to replace. I finally drove with no speedometer for months." Build quality was another sore point. The Laser XT was covered in cheap plastic, inside and out. The doors were heavy, but didn't close with any confidence. Panels warped in the sun, and squeaks and rattles developed quickly. The interior tried to look futuristic, but it felt toy-like, especially when compared to the solid, understated cabins of its Japanese rivals. Chrysler hyped the luxury sport aspect of the Laser, but most buyers quickly realized it was just another front-wheel drive Mopar product with different badges and gimmicks. Worse yet, the Laser was completely overshadowed by its sibling, the Dodge Daytona. The Daytona had more aggressive styling, better marketing, and a sportier image. The Laser, meant to be the classy version, ended up as the forgotten stepchild. Buyers who wanted performance went straight for the Dodge, while those looking for refinement went to imports. That left the Laser stranded in a no-man's land of mediocrity. Reliability was the final nail in the coffin. The turbo engines were notoriously fragile if not meticulously maintained. The transmissions had a bad habit of giving up under stress, and the electronics were a constant headache. Stories from owners paint a grim picture. Turbos blowing at under 60,000 miles, dashboards going dark in the middle of night drives, and paint that peeled after just a few years. One former owner summed it up best. "I bought the Laser XT because it looked like the future. It broke so often that I realized the future was already junk." By the late 1980s, Chrysler quietly let the Laser fade away, discontinuing it after 1986, while the Daytona lived on with updates and performance packages. The Laser, meanwhile, became one of those forgotten footnotes in Chrysler's lineup, remembered only by enthusiasts who had the misfortune or the curiosity to own one. Today, the 1986 Chrysler Laser XT is almost extinct. Few survived the abuse of daily driving, and even fewer were cared enough to make it to the modern era. Collectors don't want them, restorers avoid them, and even Chrysler enthusiasts often cringe at the mention of them. In 2025, the Laser XT stands as a perfect example of 1980s automaker hubris, overpromised, underdelivered, and ultimately abandoned. Would you like me to take the next one even further and not just describe the car itself, but also dive into how these kinds of fake high-tech gimmicks destroyed buyer trust in Detroit during the 80s?
The 1983 Renault Alliance, built by AMC in Kenosha, Wisconsin, is one of those cars that perfectly captures the missteps, compromises, and cultural collisions of the early 1980s American auto industry. When it was launched, the Alliance was hailed as AMC's bold attempt to fight back against the rising tide of Japanese imports. Gasoline prices were high, buyers were looking for fuel efficiency, and the Japanese were selling small, reliable, rust-free cars that could easily last a decade. AMC, struggling to stay alive, partnered with Renault to produce a French-designed subcompact in the United States, hoping to give buyers a European experience with domestic convenience. On paper, it seemed brilliant, a modern, efficient, front-wheel drive car with fresh styling and a French pedigree. But in reality, it was a mechanical and cultural disaster. The Alliance came with a choice of 1.4 or 1.7-liter inline-4 engines designed for economy, not excitement. These engines delivered modest power, around 64 to 77 horsepower, which was enough to move the car at city speeds, but laughable on the highway. Acceleration was sluggish, the clutch engagement was finicky, and torque steer on inclines made uphill merges feel like a battle. The car's lightweight chassis gave it a floating, unstable feel at higher speeds, and its small drum brakes, even on some trims, struggled to provide confidence in emergency stops. Even by 1983 standards, the Alliance's performance was uninspiring, leaving it trailing well behind rivals like the Honda Civic, Toyota Corolla, and Volkswagen Rabbit. Rust was one of the Alliance's most infamous problems. Even new examples could develop corrosion in the fenders, door bottoms, and wheel arches within a year of purchase. AMC's factory prep and rust proofing were minimal, and the combination of Wisconsin winters and cheap steel meant the cars didn't stand a chance. Owners tell stories of new Alliances showing bubbling paint before winter was over, with some panels literally rotting from the inside out. It wasn't just cosmetic. Structural integrity suffered, making the car feel unsafe and cheap. Electrical issues compounded the misery. Wiring harnesses were prone to corrosion, switches failed without warning, and the dashboard instruments frequently went dark. Owners remember headlights that flickered randomly, heaters that stopped working midwinter, and horns that refused to honk at critical moments. One longtime owner later admitted, "The car's only reliable function was to disappoint me." Even basic repairs were tricky, as the French design required odd connectors and components that weren't common in the American parts network, meaning repairs were expensive and slow. The interior of the Alliance was another disappointment. Cheap plastics, poorly fitted panels, and seats that sagged within months made the cabin feel like a temporary solution rather than a permanent vehicle. Controls were awkwardly placed, ergonomics were strange, and many drivers complained about excessive road and wind noise. The AM/FM radio, when functional, was a high point, but it was also the source of many complaints as it often cut out entirely. By 1985, most owners had learned that a trip to the dealer for minor repairs was a monthly routine. Despite this, AMC tried to market the Alliance as a practical, European-inspired alternative to imports, emphasizing its fuel economy and compact dimensions. Awards from magazines like Motor Trend, the car even won Car of the Year in 1983, initially gave it an air of credibility, but the reality quickly caught up. Reliability was poor, parts were scarce, and resale values plummeted. Dealers were overwhelmed with warranty claims, and many early owners abandoned the car after just a few years. One ex-owner summed it up bluntly: "It was supposed to be a smart little car, but it was smarter to trade it in fast." By 2025, the Renault Alliance is remembered less for its design or ambition than for the headaches it caused. It has become a punchline among collectors and enthusiasts, often cited as the quintessential example of French car built in Wisconsin, a combination of exotic design and domestic shortcuts that resulted in a fragile, rust-prone, electrically finicky disaster. Rare survivors exist, but they're typically cherished by niche collectors with a taste for the absurd, rather than real automotive performance or reliability. Most enthusiasts treat the Alliance as a cautionary tale about badge engineering, rushed partnerships, and the dangers of trying to compete with imports without the necessary investment in quality control. The Alliance may have had ambitions, but in reality it left a trail of disappointment. It wasn't fast, it wasn't durable, and it certainly wasn't exciting. For many, it embodies a bygone era when American automakers were desperate, experimental, and often tragically off-target. Even today, spotting an intact Alliance is enough to elicit laughter, shakes of the head, and reminiscences of the car that tried so hard and failed so spectacularly. Do you want me to expand the story further by including first-hand owner anecdotes from the 1980s, showing exactly how Alliance owners endured its constant rust and electrical failures?
The 1988 Oldsmobile Cutlass Calais Quad 4 is one of those cars that perfectly encapsulates the 1980s era of overpromising and under-delivering, where marketing bravado tried to mask engineering compromises. GM launched the Quad 4 engine with a thunderous fanfare, claiming it was the future of American performance, a dual overhead cam, 16-valve, 4-cylinder engine producing 150 horsepower straight out of a compact front-wheel drive package. It sounded like a revolutionary idea on paper, a small displacement, high-revving engine that could deliver sporty performance without the weight or gas guzzling of the V6 or V8. The problem? GM wrapped it in a bland, uninspired Calais body, made it front-wheel drive, and, in typical GM fashion of the era, delivered an engine that was far noisier, harsher, and less reliable than anyone expected. The Quad-4 engine was raw, raspy, and intrusive. At idle, it droned like a swarm of angry bees, and when pushed hard, it produced a high-pitched, unrefined scream. Enthusiasts might have appreciated the high-revving nature in theory, but in practice, it was grating. Torque was modest, peaking only at the upper end of the rev range, which meant that highway passing or city acceleration required keeping the engine near redline, a combination that stressed the drivetrain and made the car feel more like a buzzy go-kart than a smooth, modern vehicle. Reliability was another sticking point. Early Quad-4 engines were prone to head gasket failures, timing chain wear, and rough idling, and they demanded careful maintenance to avoid catastrophic failures. Owners quickly learned that ignoring oil changes or running low-grade fuel could end in expensive repairs. The Calais body did little to help the illusion of sportiness. GM dressed it up with subtle badges, upgraded alloys, and a slightly stiffer suspension, but it remained a compact economy sedan at heart. Inside, the interior was plain, utilitarian, and quiet only by comparison to the racket of the engine itself. The car's styling was forgettable: boxy lines, bland grille, and no defining features that hinted at speed or excitement. Marketing tried to sell it as a sporty, high-tech package, but buyers and critics alike recognized it as an eco-box with a noisy engine bolted on. Owners' stories from the late 1980s illustrate the car's contradictions. One owner recounted, "It sounded fast, really fast, but by the time you got going, you realized it wasn't, and then you had to deal with rattles, squeaks, and a timing chain that complained if you didn't baby it." Another quipped, "GM said it was revolutionary. I say it was an alarm clock in a car body." The Quad-4's refinement issues and mechanical quirks ensured that many early adopters regretted buying the car after a few years, and resale values collapsed quickly. On the road, the Cutlass Calais Quad-4 had moments of fun if driven aggressively. The high-revving engine encouraged spirited driving, and the front-wheel drive chassis was nimble enough to entertain on twisty back roads. But in reality, the thrills were short-lived. Every acceleration, every cornering maneuver reminded the driver that the car was fundamentally a small economy car with a temperamental and demanding engine grafted onto it. The disconnect between the marketing promise of a sporty, revolutionary performance compact and the reality of harsh NVH, limited torque, and long-term maintenance issues left a sour taste. By 2025, the 1988 Cutlass Calais Quad-4 occupies a curious place in automotive history. It is remembered as a bold experiment, a glimpse at GM's attempt to modernize and produce a technologically advanced engine for mass-market cars, but also as a cautionary tale of hype outpacing execution. Few survived in good condition, and even fewer have any real collectible value. Enthusiasts generally view it as a quirky artifact, an engine that deserved better packaging, and a car that promised excitement it couldn't deliver. In essence, the 1988 Cutlass Calais Quad-4 is the classic case of an ambitious idea suffocated by poor execution. GM promised sportiness, modernity, and performance. The reality was loud, fussy, and forgettable. For anyone spotting one today, it's a reminder that innovation alone cannot rescue a bland economy car, and that even a technically interesting engine can't hide a fundamentally uninspired vehicle. Do you want me to continue the series with the next 80s marketing disaster car, highlighting not just mechanical flaws, but also how GM's hype campaigns backfired spectacularly?
The 1987 Buick Somerset Regal is one of those rare vehicles that perfectly embodies the awkward contradictions of late 1980s GM sedans. A car that tried desperately to be sporty, refined, and modern, yet failed on every front. Buick, historically associated with comfort, quietness, and upscale luxury, suddenly attempted to appeal to younger buyers with the Somerset Regal, a derivative of the front-wheel drive GM A-body platform. The idea was simple: combine the Regal name's perceived prestige with a sportier chassis, firmer suspension, and slightly sharper styling cues. The execution, however, left a lot to be desired. The Somerset Regal was underpowered from the start. Most models came with the standard 2.5-liter or 3.0-liter V6, producing between 110 and 135 horsepower. Performance was sluggish at best. 0 to 60 times were in the 12 to 14-second range, leaving the car painfully behind anything resembling a sporty compact or mid-size sedan of the era. Passing on highways required careful planning, and even minor inclines could reduce acceleration to a crawl. Buick attempted to inject excitement by adding a firmer suspension and slightly wider tires on some trims, but the car's soft, heavy body and compromised weight distribution meant it handled like a sofa with wheels. Steering was numb, body roll was constant, and even modest cornering produced a distinctly detached, floaty feeling. Styling was another strike against it. Buick's designers clearly wanted to suggest a sporty modernity without alienating traditional buyers, and the result was a vehicle that looked like a flat, featureless ironing board on wheels. The long, slabby hood, low-slung roofline, and bland, unadorned sheet metal gave it almost no visual personality. Add to that the faux grille treatment and boxy taillights, and you have a car that could vanish in any parking lot without leaving an impression. Attempts at sporty trim packages, pinstripes, alloy wheels, or darker plastics did little to elevate its appearance. Inside, the Somerset Regal was cramped and uninspiring. Front passengers had just enough room, but rear seat legroom was tight, especially compared to the larger Buick sedans of previous years. The dashboard was dominated by cheap plastics, and control placement was awkward, reflecting GM's mid-80s tendency to cut corners in interiors to hit cost targets. Upholstery sagged over time, and rattles and squeaks became common complaints almost immediately. Owners also noted the car felt heavy and cumbersome, exacerbating the sense that it was neither sporty nor refined. Reliability was mixed. The V6 engines themselves were generally durable if properly maintained, but the Somerset suffered from common GM-era issues: automatic transmission failures, faulty electrical connections, and suspension components wearing prematurely. Some owners reported persistent dashboard illumination failures, climate controls that stopped working mid-summer, and door locks that refused to engage. One owner wryly summarized, "I bought it thinking I was getting a Regal with some fun. What I got was a rolling IKEA shelf that needed constant babysitting." Marketing tried to position the Somerset Regal as a hidden classic, a refined, sporty alternative to the larger, softer sedans in Buick's lineup. Magazines of the era highlighted its quiet ride at low speeds and claimed it had a, quote, European-inspired feel, unquote. But the reality on the road was disappointing. It was neither refined like a LeSabre nor fun like a contemporary European sedan. It occupied an awkward middle ground, too heavy for a compact, too small for a midsize, too slow for anyone seeking excitement. By 2025, the Somerset Regal has become almost entirely forgotten, yet some desperate sellers still try to market survivors as hidden classics or underrated 80s Buicks. Enthusiasts and collectors rarely buy them, recognizing that the car's novelty lies only in its rarity, not in performance, styling, or charm. Most surviving examples are worn, rusted, or mechanically tired, and restoring one generally isn't worth the effort. Ultimately, the 1987 Buick Somerset Regal is remembered as an ambitious but failed experiment, a car that attempted to blend sportiness with traditional Buick class, but delivered neither. It serves as a cautionary tale about overreaching design, misaligned marketing, and the pitfalls of trying to appeal to audiences that were no longer interested in what GM was offering. For anyone who sees one today advertised as a hidden classic, the reality is simple. It's a bland, slow, cramped car that no one truly misses, but it does provide a fascinating snapshot of GM's confused mid-80s strategy. If you want, I can take the next car in the series and make it even longer and darker, including both period reviews and real owner horror stories, to really capture how these 80s cars destroyed brand credibility. The 1980 Dodge Mirada CMX is one of those rare examples of a car that promised glamour, power, and personal luxury, but delivered little more than mediocrity wrapped in a strikingly bland shell. Dodge had been trying to compete in the personal luxury coupe segment dominated by the likes of the Ford Thunderbird, Chevrolet Monte Carlo, and Buick Regal. The Mirada, released as a 1980 model, was supposed to be Chrysler's answer, stylish, powerful, and luxurious with a modern, wedge-shaped profile and upscale appointments designed to lure buyers who wanted the image of a personal luxury car without sacrificing American V8 power. On paper, it looked like a contender, but the reality was a lesson in how hype and badge engineering could quickly tarnish a car's reputation. The CMX trim, marketed as the top-of-the-line variant, came with plush interiors, vinyl roofs, bucket seats, and a full array of optional electronics for the era, including digital dashboards and cruise control. Under the hood, buyers could select from a range of Chrysler's small and big block V8s. The base 318 V8 was painfully slow, producing barely 150 horsepower, while the optional 360 and 400 cubic inch V8s offered more grunt but still felt lethargic in a car weighing over 3,500 pounds. Even the big block 360 or 400 struggled with acceleration, producing 0 to 60 times in the mid-10s at best, and torque steer in tighter corners made the car feel awkward and unbalanced. The handling was uninspiring. Soft springs, heavy body, and vague steering made the Mirada feel like a luxury cruiser in name only, not a performance coupe capable of the spirited driving its marketing suggested. Styling was another mixed bag. Dodge tried to project modernity with the Mirada's long hood, sloped rear deck, and sharply angled roofline. On paper, it had the wedge appeal of late 70s personal coupes, but in practice, it looked slightly awkward, heavy, and ungainly on the road. Its lines lacked the elegance of a Monte Carlo or the menace of a Thunderbird, giving the impression that Dodge had designed it in a vacuum, somewhere between flair and anonymity. The CMX's vinyl roof and two-tone paint options attempted to inject luxury cues, but to most observers, the result was overly fussy rather than refined. Inside, the Mirada CMX tried to impress with upscale appointments, simulated wood trim, velour upholstery, and full instrumentation. However, fit and finish issues were common, and the cabin felt more show than substance. Plastics were brittle, panels didn't line up perfectly, and controls were awkwardly placed. Owners from the era report that the digital dashboards, while flashy, were prone to failure, and the electronic features often added frustration rather than convenience. Long-term durability was a concern. Suspension bushings wore out quickly, brakes felt spongy, and even routine maintenance revealed cost-cutting shortcuts in build quality. Despite Chrysler's aggressive marketing campaigns and promises of personal luxury excellence, the Mirada failed to capture buyers' imaginations. It was underpowered, heavy, and handled poorly compared to its competitors. Car magazines of the period initially praised its styling and optional equipment, but reviews quickly turned critical once the performance reality set in. One journalist wrote, "The Mirada is a car that wants to be a muscle coupe, a luxury cruiser, and a personal statement all at once. Unfortunately, it's none of these things very well." Another quipped that even Richard Petty, the NASCAR legend, wouldn't waste a lap racing one. Owners' anecdotes paint a similarly grim picture. Many found themselves apologizing to passengers for the sluggish acceleration, nervous about cornering at higher speeds, and frustrated with minor electrical issues or rattles that developed in the first few thousand miles. One former owner recalled, "I bought it for the looks and luxury, but after a week I realized the engine couldn't move the car fast enough to make the styling look good." Others noted that resale values were poor almost immediately, and by the mid-1980s, the Mirada was nearly forgotten, despite Dodge having invested heavily in marketing and option packages. Today, the 1980 Dodge Mirada CMX is a ghost of a car. It rarely appears in shows, it's seldom preserved, and when it does pop up, it's generally as a curiosity rather than a sought-after classic. Its reputation is that of a well-intentioned failure, a car that promised style, performance, and luxury, but delivered slow acceleration, limp handling, and a heavy dose of disappointment. It stands as a testament to how a strong nameplate and aggressive marketing cannot compensate for underpowered engineering and a lack of cohesion in design. In 2025, spotting a Mirada CMX is enough to make enthusiasts shake their heads and laugh at Chrysler's missteps during this era. It's a car that aimed to compete with America's finest personal luxury coupes, but ended up being remembered as the one vehicle even Richard Petty wouldn't race. A fitting epitaph for a personal luxury flop that tried and spectacularly failed to impress.
The 1989 Mercury Topaz XR5 is one of those cars that perfectly exemplifies the awkward attempts by American automakers in the late 1980s to inject sportiness into fundamentally uninspiring economy cars. Mercury, historically a mid-tier Ford brand trying to straddle the line between mainstream and luxury, wanted to give buyers a fun alternative to the dull Topaz, which itself was an almost anonymous front-wheel drive compact derived from the Ford Tempo. The XR5 badge suggested excitement, performance, and handling prowess, but in reality, it was little more than cosmetic tweaks applied to a car with all the soul of a filing cabinet on wheels. Under the hood, the XR5 was typically powered by the 2.3-liter inline-4 or an optional 2.5-liter, producing somewhere between 88 and 100 horsepower. That's not horsepower you could brag about in 1989, and certainly not enough to make a compact with the XR5's modest suspension upgrades feel lively. Acceleration was lethargic. 0 to 60 times crept into the low 12-second range, and the car struggled on hills, especially when carrying a passenger or luggage. Ford engineers tried to spruce things up with a slightly stiffer suspension, upgraded sway bars, and sportier wheels, but the chassis still suffered from soft bushings, vague steering, and body roll that made spirited cornering a nervous affair. The XR5 could be called nimble in theory, but in practice, it was a front-wheel drive economy car with a sport badge, never an actual performance machine. Styling attempted to suggest excitement, but the result was mixed at best. Blacked-out trim, body-colored bumpers, and alloy wheels hinted at performance, but the boxy, bland lines of the Topaz platform were impossible to disguise. Even with XR5 graphics and slightly more aggressive front and rear fascia treatments, the car looked like an economy sedan that had been given a cheap costume rather than a true performance makeover. The interior followed the same pattern. Simple, utilitarian plastics, basic instrumentation, and cramped rear seats that offered little comfort or sportiness. The XR5 trim included slightly better seat bolstering and sportier steering wheel designs, but these were cosmetic at best and did little to mask the car's mediocrity. The mechanical side of the XR5 was particularly unforgiving. The automatic transmissions, especially the 3-speed units, were prone to failure, and owners often reported rough shifts, overheating, and complete breakdowns if maintenance was neglected. Even the manual transmissions, while marginally better in terms of engagement, could be clunky and imprecise, especially after moderate mileage. Electrical gremlins were also common. Faulty sensors, stubborn fuel gauges, and occasional dashboard failures contributed to a sense that the XR5 was more headache than thrill. One longtime owner recalled, "It looked fast sitting still, but as soon as you tried to drive it hard, you realized it couldn't keep up with a minivan." Media coverage at the time wasn't kind. Reviewers repeatedly noted the lack of punch in the engine, the uninspiring handling, and the sense that Mercury had tried to dress up a slow, forgettable sedan with sporty trimmings. One magazine quipped, "The XR5 is proof that putting sporty badges on an economy car does not make it sporty. It's a costume, not a performance upgrade." Consumer complaints echoed this sentiment, focusing heavily on transmission issues, weak acceleration, and a general feeling of disappointment when the car was driven beyond city speeds.
Today, the 1989 Mercury Topaz XR5 is largely forgotten, and for good reason. Collectors and enthusiasts avoid it like the plague, recognizing that it offers none of the charm, performance, or rarity that make older cars worth preserving. Rare survivors may exist in private collections, but most examples succumbed to rust, neglect, or early mechanical failure. Its reputation is cemented as a cautionary tale, a car that tried to turn an uninspired practical sedan into a sporty compact, only to fail spectacularly. In 2025, spotting an XR5 is enough to make even die-hard Mercury fans shake their heads. It stands as a perfect example of badge engineering gone wrong, a car that promised excitement but delivered disappointment, mediocrity, and chronic maintenance headaches. The XR5 story is a reminder of a time when American manufacturers were desperate to compete with imports and willing to mislead buyers with sporty marketing even if the underlying product was fundamentally incapable of delivering. If you want, I can continue with the next worthless late 80s Mercury, Ford, or GM sporty car and make it even longer, weaving in contemporary press quotes, owner horror stories, and how these cars damaged brand credibility.